Certainly. Okay. Welcome everyone to this important event focused on the just energy transition in Africa. This event is hosted by the Government of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we're really excited to have your participation. We're hoping to be joined live by a large virtual audience that we've shared the link with, our partners that weren't able to be with us here in Libreville, Gabon. But please feel most welcome. And we are hoping at the end of the session to have some engagement with both the audience here in person and also online with us. My name is Megan Spires. I'm the Director of Climate Change and Energy at ECLI Africa, which serves as the host of the COMSA Secretariat. And just some important housekeeping. As said, we have got our audience joining us virtually with us that hopefully will be facilitated so we can receive some questions from the various cities around the continent that are part of the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa initiative. We'd like to, of course, thank the donors of this initiative, the European Union, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation, as well as long-term partners GIZ, AfD, and Expertise France. As said a little bit earlier, there is interpretation and translation available, so if you haven't got your headset, please ask the team on site for one. We still need one up at the front, please. And then also the session is being recorded. So we really want the discussions that we have in the room today to be taken forward, particularly in the lead up to COP27. And so the recording from the session translated into both French and Portuguese will also be distributed through the Covenant of Mayors and Sub-Saharan Africa network in the lead up to COP27. So to kick off our session today, we're very honored to have the Ambassador of the European Union to the Gabonese Republic, the Democratic Republic of Sao Tome and Principe, and the Economic Commune of the Central African States, Ms. Rosario Bento Paes. She is going to give us some opening remarks on behalf of the European Union, which, as said, is the main donor of the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa and has been supporting this important initiative on the continent for many years that is progressing climate change and energy work on the continent. So over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And well, I can do it in Portuguese and in English and French, but as I'm in Gabon, I will probably turn to French, if that is okay. Otherwise, you tell me. Je suis ravie d'être là parmi vous et d'être accompagnée exactement ici par deux maires, le maire adjoint de Kampala et aussi monsieur le maire de Kilaman à Mozambique. On a pu déjà échanger un petit peu dans notre langue maternelle, donc ça fait toujours un plaisir de pouvoir le faire. Je remercie évidemment les autorités gabonaises d'abriter cet événement majeur pour l'action climatique locale dans la région. Et l'Union européenne est fière évidemment de cofinancer cette initiative de la Convention des maires pour l'Afrique subsaharienne aux côtés des partenaires financiers, le ministère fédéral allemand de la coopération économique et développement, BMZ, et l'Agence espagnole de coopération internationale pour le développement, qui, dans un esprit d'équipe Europe, aussi de travailler conjointement avec nos États membres. Je suis personnellement ravie d'être là parce que je me suis occupée moi-même des autorités locales dans ma vie précédente. Et j'étais aussi dans la formation de ce qui est aujourd'hui les Government of Mayors au niveau global. Et je suis ravie de voir qu'il y a maintenant cette partie subsaharienne pour l'Afrique subsaharienne qui a vraiment un besoin énorme de booster. Parce que, évidemment, le changement climatique, c'est au niveau de l'adaptation au changement climatique, c'est tout à fait au niveau local qu'on peut faire le changement. Mais ici, on est à parler évidemment pour l'énergie, donc principalement pour ce qui se concerne la mitigation, mais les autorités nationales ne peuvent pas atteindre les objectifs qu'ils doivent pour réduire les gaz à effet de serre sans l'appui et sans la participation des autorités locales. Donc, les autorités locales sont clés. Je soutiens absolument le rôle que les autorités locales doivent avoir dans tout ce qui est le changement climatique, soit la mitigation, soit l'adaptation. Et sans elles, ce n'est pas possible de le faire. Ce sont eux qui savent comment faire la transformation et surtout dans la partie de transformation énergétique, sont eux qui peuvent effectivement mieux implémenter ce changement de paradigme. La Convention des maires en Afrique subsaharienne a été initiée en 2015 et elle est un catalyseur majeur exactement de l'action climatique dans la région. Il y a un engagement politique de plus de 300 gouvernements locaux déjà, qui a pour objectif d'aider les gouvernements locaux à passer de la planification à la mise en œuvre d'actions concrètes en mettant l'accent sur le déblocage du financement climatique au niveau local, qui est absolument essentiel parce que sans le financement, évidemment, les maires ne peuvent rien faire. Cette initiative soutient la dimension externe du pacte vert pour l'Europe, car les défis mondiaux du changement climatique et de dégradation de l'environnement nécessitent une réponse mondiale. Plus encore, cette initiative contribue aussi à renforcer le partenariat de l'Afrique et l'Union européenne et soutient l'agenda 2063 de la Commission de l'Union africaine. La Convention des maires en Afrique subsaharienne constitue la composante régionale de la Convention mondiale des maires pour le climat et l'énergie, qui est un partenariat entre les réseaux des villes, des agences de développement et des institutions de financement qui aident les villes à relever le double défi de changement climatique et de l'accès à l'énergie pour aboutir à un avenir énergétique durable, à faible émission à effet de serre et résilient au climat, donc, dont je parlais tout à l'heure. On sait bien que le continent africain contribue avec moins de 10% des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, mais c'est malheureusement le continent qui souffre le plus en ce qui concerne l'exposition aux impacts adverses du changement climatique. Et ces impacts peuvent réduire les gains en matière de développement. De là, l'urgence pour l'Afrique de tracer la voie d'un avenir résilient. Il y a des faibles émissions de carbone. Et dans le premier jour, j'ai aussi été dans un panel où on disait mais pourquoi l'Afrique doit faire cet effort de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre si on souffre de ce les autres ont fait. Bon, si l'Afrique veut faire les mêmes erreurs que les autres ont fait dans le passé, ça ne sert à rien. Et on peut démontrer au niveau européen qu'on peut avoir une croissance économique avec une réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre. En 1990, on avait 17% à 18% d'émissions en Europe. Dans les jours d'aujourd'hui, on compte 8% au niveau global. Donc, on peut continuer à avoir une croissance économique en réduisant les gaz à effet de serre. Et c'est ça qu'on veut aider l'Afrique à faire, ce leapfrog, comme on l'appelle en anglais, pour ne pas faire exactement les erreurs de la révolution industrielle. 35% des émissions totales sur le continent africain proviennent en effet du secteur de l'énergie. Alors que l'Afrique s'efforce d'atteindre ses objectifs de résilience climatique et de développement durable, le déploiement des technologies d'énergie renouvelable qui ont un immense potentiel dans de nombreuses villes africaines peut réduire considérablement ces émissions et éviter éventuelles émissions futures. La transition énergétique équitable est défendue, c'est ça qu'on défendait lundi, comme je disais, comme une solution permettant non seulement de faciliter une action audacieuse et ambitieuse en matière de changement climatique, mais aussi de s'assurer que les défis socio-économiques sont pris en compte et améliorés grâce au concept d'équité et de prise en compte des personnes. Donc, évidemment, ça doit être pris en compte dans la transition énergétique équitable. Ces transitions peuvent répondre aux défis fondamentaux de nos systèmes énergétiques, tels que le manque d'accès à l'énergie durable et l'insécurité énergétique. Et en outre, les transitions énergétiques équitables devraient également être conçues pour exploiter les multiples avantages comparatifs qu'elles offrent, tels que la croissance économique verte, la création d'emplois décents et le développement des entreprises, pour contribuer à atteindre d'une manière plus accélérée les objectifs de développement durable et améliorer la qualité de vie de tous. Malheureusement, cela est souvent plus facile, évidemment, à dire qu'à faire, mais ça nécessite une organisation, une planification minutieuse et la mise en place des conditions cadres favorables politiques, institutionnelles et économiques. À cet égard, des outils tels que les plans d'action pour l'accès à l'énergie durable et le climat, qui sont en cours d'élaboration dans le cadre du programme de la Convention des maires pour l'Afrique subsaharienne, sont très importants. Non seulement ils ont une valeur en termes de stratégie d'atténuation et d'accès durable à l'énergie pour les villes, mais ils fournissent également une orientation cardinale pour les villes et soutiennent le renforcement de leurs capacités institutionnelles et la préparation à la transition. Enfin, les transitions énergétiques équitables requièrent des montants considérables d'investissement qui n'affluent pas toujours vers les villes africaines, dont les ressources propres peuvent ne pas être suffisantes pour répondre à l'intégralité de leurs besoins financiers. Et c'est pourquoi, au sommet de l'Union européenne-Union africaine qui s'est tenu en février 2022 à Bruxelles, on a mis en avant ce qu'on appelle la stratégie Global Gateway, en français passerelle mondiale, que c'est exactement de faire des investissements durables à grande échelle dans les domaines de l'énergie, des transports et des infrastructures numériques. Le paquet d'investissement pour l'Afrique seulement est de 150 milliards d'euros. Pour le monde au niveau global, c'est de 300 milliards d'euros. So billions, not millions. Pour faire bien la traduction. Je n'ai pas entendu, mais quelquefois on fait mal la traduction. Donc it's 150 billion. 150 milliards pour l'Afrique. Et ça, c'est exactement pour soutenir l'Afrique dans son développement et sa transformation durable, inclusive, écologique et numérique, incluant à l'échelle de ses villes à travers le plan d'action pour l'accès à l'énergie durable et le climat. C'est pourquoi c'est tellement important ces plans. Entre autres, l'Union européenne mobilisera aussi 2,4 milliards d'euros de subventions pour l'Afrique subsaharienne afin de soutenir les énergies renouvelables, l'efficacité énergétique, la transition énergétique équitable et le verdissement des chaînes de valeur locales. Le déploiement de l'initiative Afrique-Union européenne pour l'énergie verte contribuera au développement du secteur de l'hydrogène renouvelable, à l'intégration des marchés régionaux de l'énergie et à la mise en place d'un marché unique de l'électricité en Afrique. Cela inclura évidemment des soutiens aux domaines connexes comme les infrastructures des transports, les capacités dans les domaines de la technologie, de l'innovation et de la formation professionnelle. Le Global Gateway, la passerelle mondiale en français, sera mise en œuvre à travers des initiatives phares au niveau régional et national, en travaillant avec les États membres de l'Union européenne, les institutions financières de développement comme la Banque européenne d'investissement et bien sûr le secteur privé qu'on veut booster. Donc tout ça a démarré, c'est de 2022 à 2027, et donc ces 150 milliards, c'est pour 2022-27. Donc on est déjà en train de les mettre en fonction. Je viens de signer des choses sur ces questions pour le Gabon. Donc voilà, je voulais avec ça vous donner un peu des pistes et des solutions possibles, mais je voulais surtout entendre les expériences et les leçons exactement apprises par les villes signataires de la Convention des maires pour l'Afrique subsaharienne, et je suis convaincue que cela sera une source d'inspiration pour d'autres villes africaines qui sont encore à hésiter à s'engager. Pour clôturer, alors que nous poursuivons des actions audacieuses en matière de climat et d'énergie, nous devons garantir une approche inclusive de développement qui ne laisse personne de côté. Sinon quoi, le changement climatique continuera à avoir un impact disproportionné sur les femmes, les jeunes et les groupes vulnérables en Afrique. Et la question demeure, pour qui planifions-nous ces villes? Merci à tous pour votre attention et participation et engagement. Je vous souhaite de bons succès pour l'événement et je suis ravie d'entendre et de participer aussi aux discussions. Merci.
Thank you very much to the ambassador, and in particular for calling us to question who we're doing this for, because ultimately it's about the most vulnerable and the poor in society that are dealing with the brunt of climate change impacts. We are now going to look at just a few slides to create some context for this session focused on the just energy transition, and then we'll be turning to some male representatives to share some thoughts in relation to some questions, as well as some representatives from key policy think tanks, as well as from the African Development Bank. So if we could just go to the next slide. So this statistics that you see on the screen comes from the recent IPCC report, and it's quite hard to read these numbers. They feel almost devastating to one to see numbers like 2,600% increase in frequency of flooding in relation to the overlay of urbanization and climate change. And we put this on the screen really to say that what the IPCC report, and there were many of them released this year, are really saying to us is that we are in an urgent situation. There is an urgency to dealing with climate change. And I'm hoping when, in particular, the mayors share their experience, they will reflect on some of the impacts that are already being felt in their cities. And so this isn't a problem in 10 years from now or 50 years from now. It's being felt by our communities today and tomorrow. Next slide. This particular slide speaks to the focus of this session on the just energy transition. It speaks about the fact that there are a significant proportion of the African population that does not currently have access to energy. The numbers are on the screen. There are also even larger numbers that do not have access to clean cooking. And this means not only mass deforestation in many of our cities, but it also means pollution. And that affects health, of course. So this is the focus of this session's discussion, amongst other things. And it's really about how do we, working in the African city context, assist our cities and our communities to gain access to energy, but in a way that is low carbon and climate resilient. And what are those solutions that we can put on the table? Just as further context on this, and something which speaks to the inequality of the issue of climate change, is the fact that a recent research report showed that there's actually a condensation of lack of energy access in Africa, and the rest of the world is increasing more quickly in terms of access to energy. So we have to solve this for our continent. It's actually a human rights issue at its core. Next slide. let's look then at the opportunities. We're on a continent that has got an abundance of renewable energy potential, particularly solar. And I think what I'd love to hear discussion about today is around what innovations are we seeing in our cities where the renewable energy that we have access to is being harnessed, not just in bringing technologies in from elsewhere, particularly from the global north, but African-based solutions for African cities. Next slide. This slide is just to depict that climate change is very much a developmental issue. For many years, it was described as an environmental issue, and I think it's now common knowledge that climate change and development are one and the same, and we need to be developing in a climate resilient way. And what this statistics also from the IPCC report shows is that to deal with climate change is going to have benefits from a GDP perspective. And we're already seeing how GDPs are affected by the climate ramifications that are occurring in many of our cities across the continent. Next slide. So here we're speaking about the need for finance, and the just energy transition is only going to occur if finance flows. And particularly from the Government of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa side, we're looking to see ways in which this finance can flow directly to cities. Many of our mayors speak about the fact that most climate finance flows to national governments, and we understand the modalities of why this occurs, but there's an essential need for that finance to be devolved down to the city level where the rubber hits the road in terms of climate change, so that our mayors and our city managers that know their cities best are able to implement solutions that make sense in their contexts. Next slide. So this is where CoMSA, as we call it, comes in, and the host of today's session. You'll see on the screen all the cities that are currently members or signatories of CoMSA across the continent, and this is growing. There are over 300 cities that have signed up to the initiative, and these are essentially the leaders on the continent that are tackling climate change. You'll also see that it represents a huge proportion of the population of the continent. 137 million people. And it's an initiative that's about partnering. There's this term often used in European Union circles of Team Europe. It really is about partnering with those organizations that can play to their strengths and bring their advantages to the table to make a difference in African cities. Also important to note, this is part of the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is the leading initiative globally for cities and regions that are taking action on climate change. And just that initiative represents over 12,000 cities across the globe. So we're making those linkages into the global discourse on cities and climate change. Next slide. This is the last slide. This is to frame this conversation. We were looking for, is there one organization that can give us a clear definition around what a just energy transition is? And in fact, we couldn't find one reputable organization. We were looking for a definition in the IPCC, but at the heart of it, what the just energy transition is about, and we really liked how this was depicted, is that it's putting people and communities at the center of the transition away from fossil fuels. So the debate and the conversation I can hope we can have today is about how do we transition our communities away from fossil fuels, but make absolutely sure that the poor and the most vulnerable are not negatively affected by this transition. We have to make sure that developmental gains are withheld and in fact improved as we move towards climate resilient development. So that just is some framing for the upcoming discussion. We're now going to move into, for me, what is a much more exciting part is to hear from our panelists. And I just want to introduce them first. On my immediate left is Dr. Manuel Dourajo, the mayor of Quelimane, Mozambique. He is also a member of the Regional Mayors Forum of CoMSA. The Regional Mayors Forum of CoMSA are elected mayors that have come onto this forum to lead the whole initiative and engage in their regions. And so Mayor Raja, of course, does that across the continent, but in particular for Southern Africa. And then to his left, we've got Ms. Doreen Inyanjura, the Deputy Lord Mayor of Kampala, Capital City Authority. Who also Kampala, leading city in the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Lord Mayor himself sits on the RMF, as we call it. Then Engineer Solomon, if you want to just stand, Engineer Solomon Noy is the Director of Waste Management at the Accra Metropolitan Assembly. Accra has for many, many years been a climate change leader on the continent, and he's here representing his municipality. Then we've also got representation, importantly, from our financial partners. So Dr. Olufonso Somoran is here. He's the Regional Principal Officer for the Climate Change and Green Growth Program at the African Development Bank. And I'm sure we're all aware of the extensive work that the African Development Bank is doing to unlock finance for building resilience on the continent. And then Ms. Laura Williamson is here, and she heads up the memberships and institutional partnerships at REN21. And REN21 has for many, many years been looking at what are the gaps in policy making that can help unlock renewable energy, and where do we need to plug those so that we can move towards action. So we're going to start with you, Mayor Rajo, if that's all right. The question that we wanted to propose to you, and please feel free to take this where you want, is that Mozambique has one of the lowest electrification rates in Africa. And so a just energy transition cannot occur in Mozambique without urgently increasing access to energy. So our question to you, Mayor, is when you see the opportunity for your city in particular to increase this access to energy, and how can we do that in a climate resilient way? Over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this very important panel, because I think that I was very happy when you said that access to energy is a human rights issue at a core. You know, my background is also on human rights, and I worked for several years at the headquarters of Amnesty International. So human rights issues are issues at my core, and I really do care about them. But as I said at a previous panel this morning, which was chaired by Hastings from G2040, access to energy is not a value-free issue. It's a very political contested issue, like water that we are discussing this morning, and it involves power struggle. I mean, from the north, between the north and the south, but also between central and local governments. Like the legal framework in some countries is more favorable to it, but in other countries, the powers to distribute, to produce energy is over concentrated on national government. So we need to deal with the legal framework to understand the extent to which local government can play a meaningful role, because there are some environments which are really enabling for local government to act and to be more positive, while there are other countries where the framework is quite tight, like local government are just recipients. Unfortunately, for the case of Mozambique, we changed our paradigm. When we were, before our independence, we had these small grids, like each city had its own independent grid systems or energy producing systems, which actually belonged to the local government. In Portuguese, they are called SMAE, which is Serviços Municipais de Água e Eletricidade. In English, it is Municipal Services for Water and Electricity. These bodies, which were managed by the mayor of the city, were responsible to producing, distributing both water and electricity. But upon gaining our independence in 1975, the government embarked in the so-called central command economy. And all these small institutions that were producing water and electricity were amalgamated into a national body, which was called Eletricidade de Mozambique, like Mozambican Electricity Supply Company. So these institutions then became the body that were responsible for producing and also for distributing and selling electricity. Of course, the idea at that point was that having this national body, it will allow it to more easily to go to foreign markets and borrow money and come and to invest. But in reality, it did not. Partially it happened because like they got a lot of money from the Sweden government and for the North, like Sweden, Norway, and Finland, which supported these big dreams of electrifying the country. So the country was able of extending electricity to most district and so on, based on the so-called Kaora Bassa Dam, which is one of the biggest dams in Mozambique. But of course, this approach has got some vulnerabilities because like taking energy for more than 2,000 kilometers on lines, like, it brings its own challenges in terms of losses and so on, but also the political contested issue of you seeing energy passing through your area without benefiting the local people. It's a very contested issue. That's like point one I wanted to make. But also, quite recently, Mozambique discovered significant coal and gas resources in the past decade, mainly gas resources in the northern part of the country, which unfortunately, as it happened in many countries, is leading to conflict and Muslim related insurgency in the north of the country. But of course, it shows that there are huge opportunity, and Mozambique can play a leading role, not only in Southern Africa, but in the world, because it is estimated that the reserves that are in Mozambique are compared to those of some of the Arab countries, which it's seen that like the third or fourth biggest world gas, mainly LNG reserves. In particular, recent offshore gas discoveries in the Rovuma Basin on the northern border with Tanzania, as I mentioned, could make Mozambique one of the world's leading exporters of liquefied natural gas. As Megam said, Mozambique is among the lowest electrification rates in Africa, with the national grid reaching only 21% of the population. And also, it's estimated that only 11% of the 30 million inhabitants is estimated to have electricity access through off-grid, while 80% of the citizens rely either on biomass as their sole energy source for cooking and eating. Quite recently, we implemented a project to save mangroves in my city. And people in my city, they cut mangroves mainly as a source of energy, like for cooking and eating their houses, but also for building their own houses. And the issue here is that if you cut mangroves, then you destabilize the ecosystem, but also actually mangroves are the first line of defense against erosion to my city. So by cutting them, you are like doubly jeopardizing the livelihood of the city, because most of the citizens in my city, they rely on fishing and fisheries. But so we managed to raise awareness on the citizens of my city about the importance of mangroves. But the question they raised was like, okay, we understand mangroves are very important for us. But between fish and haas, for you, Mayor, what is more important? So the issue here became, what are the alternatives? Okay, we can stop today cutting, but how are we going to survive? Between saving our lives and saving the fishing lives, what is most important? That was the question that came from the ground. And I asked some of our partners if we could come up with some alternatives. And one of the alternatives was, of course, biogas, like transforming waste into biogas and into energy. And we have been like trying some pilot projects in that, which were quite successful. But now the challenge is to scale it up, to make it sustainable. Because as a pilot, of course, a project can work, but you need to scale it up to give real alternatives to people so that they can stop cutting the mangroves. Also, I wanted to mention that the costs of grid extensions and distance involved are major barriers for access to energy. My country has got 3,000 kilometers of coast. So from for the border with South Africa, with the border to Tanzania, it's like 3,000 kilometers. And the main source of energy so far has been the Kaora Bassa Dam, which is literally at the center of the country in Tete province on the Zambezi River. So from one side to the south or the other side to the north are literally 1,500 kilometers. So the point is, how do you take that energy to that extent? The other challenging issue, and this is quite structural, it has to do with the political economy of not the post-colonial state, but also from the colonial state, because this dam was built because Portugal didn't have enough money to invest. It went into a public-private partnership, getting money from German, Swiss, and other countries to build the dam. And one of the conditions was that this dam will only be sustainable if it had a prime buyer. And the prime buyer in Southern Africa was the South African economy. So the main line was built to supply first South Africa, not Mozambique. And actually what is happening since then is that the energy is produced in bulk. It is sent like almost 2,000 kilometers to South Africa. South Africa transforms it, then sells it to Mozambique at a very high price, making it very difficult for Mozambican government to access its own energy, because the energy is produced in Mozambique. But there is this political economy issue that needs to be sorted out. The other alternative for energy is coal. But as we know, coal is being phased out. So we are on this dilemma. Should we continue with coal? Now we are exporting coal to India and to China. Like tons, every day you see convoys of trains taking coal from Tete province, either to Beira port or to Nacala port. Every single day, more than 100 wagons that take this coal. Of course, it affects the environment. Is this sustainable, or we need support to deal and invest on a more clean kinds of energy? But as I mentioned, we have 3,000 kilometers of coast, meaning that, we can also use wind power. And also given the geographical position of Mozambique, we can not only use wind, but also we have got abundant energy opportunities from solar. Like, we don't have winter in Mozambique. It's like 12-year month summer, if I could say, meaning that the opportunities are there. But what is lacking is the technology, the knowledge, and the capital to invest on solar. And I think that solar will be quite cheap for these rural areas and mainly for electrification. The Norwegian government invested on the biggest solar plant in Mozambique, which is like 200 kilometers from where my city is, in Mokuba city, which actually is supplying energy to the grid. This is like a pilot project, but it has been very successful. So we think that we need to scale up and multiply examples as such. But as for wind, we don't have any example of that technology being used. But as I also mentioned, we have the Indian Ocean. There are some techniques to transform waves into energy. So I think that those biomass, wind, waves, and solar are, I think, the most sustainable and cheap sources that Mozambique would move. And as I think this year is a very important year for Africa when discussing this matter, especially because taking into account that COP27 will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh in November, so in Africa. So I think that this presents a great opportunity for all of us to showcase our journeys in the world stage, but also demand bolder and more ambitious climate action for the rest of the world. Because as we know, Africa is one of the least polluting continents, but actually we are paying a high price. Just to end, I want to say that in the last 5 years, we had not only more flooding, but also more extreme events, like the city of Beira 3 years ago was destroyed by 90% of its infrastructure due to Cyclone Idai. But since then, we had 4 other cyclones, Cyclone Anna, Cyclone Kenneth, Cyclone Gombe, and so on. So it's like these cyclones are becoming not only more frequent, but more intense in the destruction and their impacts on the livelihoods in our cities. Just to finalize, we as mayors and local government, I think that we are at the forefront because we are the ones who really face the challenge of energy scarcity, but also of climate change, extreme events when they affect our areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I think in particular, I'm inspired from you just sharing the complexity in terms of what your city has to deal with. Climate change is not just a developmental issue, it's a political issue, it's a human rights issue, and Deputy Lord Mayor, it's also a social justice issue. We were in a session together this morning focused on nature-based solutions, and the moderator was pushing us all to talk about power. Where does the power lie in cities? Are we reinforcing power dynamics in the work that we're doing in climate change, or are we questioning them and bringing them into disrepute, perhaps? So, Deputy Lord Mayor, could you share a little bit about the climate change work happening in your city of Kampala, but in particular, are you seeing inspiring action being taken by those that are most vulnerable to climate change? And if so, how can we support those actions?
Thank you very much for that question. Of course, like stated, I'm very passionate about issues to do with social justice. And of course, when we talk about social justice, this means fairness, both in terms of opportunities, in terms of accessibility, and in terms of privileges. And of course, for me as a human rights activist, it actually defeats my understanding that even in this era, we are still talking about certain groups like women, PWDs that have been left behind. I think it should really be absurd, and this should concern everyone. But of course, not surprising, because especially for us, the women, we are well aware that even the few rights that we enjoy currently, people had to first be arrested, women had to first be imprisoned for us women to enjoy the few rights that we enjoy. Talk about voting, talk about me standing here and talking a gathering. So this is a debate that we need to continue having. And this is a call to us that have the platform to continue advocating for groups such as women and PWDs, who in all sense have been left behind. Of course, when climate change happens, the women, the PWDs, are the most vulnerable. And, you know, I was looking at my colleague and I was asking him, you know, the last time we met, you are not moving on, he was not using walking sticks. Yes, but today he's working with sticks. So I think this calls us to be deliberate when we are doing our planning, because anytime anything can happen. When floods hit Kampala, definitely it is the PWDs that are affected most. And yet this is a group that we hardly think about. And yet this is a group that many of us hardly plan for. And unfortunately, they cannot speak for themselves. They can't speak for themselves, but I mean, usually they are few. And usually they need someone to amplify their voices. And some of us are ready and are prepared to do that. When we talk about when we get catastrophes, it is the women. Of course, men have an advantage. For example, if floods that happen here and we have a pregnant woman, definitely that woman will be affected more. If we have scarcity of water, definitely it is the women that are going to be affected more. So do I see the future for these vulnerable groups? What is in for them? I think this vulnerable group, I don't know, even calling them vulnerable, really, somehow I feel quite uncomfortable, but that is how we call them. I think we can only see a future for these groups when governments decide to be deliberate and plan for them in whatever sense. Let it be climate, in all aspects, because we know this is a group that is usually left behind. I see hope when you and I start speaking on their behalf. I see hope for this category and the PWD specifically when we stop focusing at their disabilities and focus on their abilities, because they also have their abilities and I believe they have what it takes to change the course. So yes, there is hope if we act, there is hope if our governments take deliberate actions, and there is hope if we start focusing on their abilities and not disabilities. Now, since we are talking about renewable energy, I felt I should also give you a few statistics from my country. And currently, it is estimated that less than 10% of the population is using clean and efficient energy or cooking stoves, only 10%. Similarly, the institutions in Uganda, such as schools, health centers, prisons, commercial buildings, restaurants, primarily rely on traditional cooking technologies, such as stone firewood stoves and open fires. In fact, further research indicates that 14.8% of the entire population has access to hydroelectricity and solar power grid services. And of course, mostly around 90% of what is used is food fuel for cooking, followed by 4% of the charcoal. One challenge in the energy sector is the low level of access to electricity, which now stands at about 17%, and the other is the low per capita electricity. And of course, when you are talking about the vulnerable, I don't know, there's a trend in my country, because when you to look at the use of solar, this is largely used by the urban poor. The people in towns, most of them use hydroelectricity power. And now the poor are usually inspired by the rich. So when they see the rich or those privileged, those in towns using hydroelectricity power, they feel maybe they are being discriminated and therefore they intend to abandon the use of solar. And yet the hydro that we are talking about, our unit is very expensive and cannot be afforded by many of them. So if we really had a responsible government, these are some of the things that would be put into consideration. We say maybe a unit of electricity should be at a friendly and affordable price. Unfortunately, that is not the case. But like they say, the struggle continues. Ours is to continue advocating for groups that are being left behind.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deputy Lord Mayor. Call for action, that's for sure, a call for action to all of us. I want to now call up Engineer Solomon Noy to come and share his thoughts on behalf of Accra. Solomon is an expert in waste and water and sanitation, and all of that has a nexus with energy. Perhaps, Engineer Solomon, you can share some positive stories from Accra in terms of how you're tackling this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I bring you greetings from our Honorable Lady Mayor of the Accra Metropolitan Assembly. She would have very much loved to be here, but for equally other official duties, she was unable to be here. But for sure, COP27, you will see her live. Yes, Accra, we have been in the forefront for climate actions for a very long time, because we know that the statistics are quite daring. By 2050, we are quite aware that Africa's urban population will triple, and in fact will be about the second largest urban population in the whole world. Yet, Africa contributes about 4% to global greenhouse gas emissions. But when it comes to financing, Africa receives just a total of about 3% of the funds that are into climate actions. So what we are doing is in the energy, transport, and waste sector, especially the waste sector, because we scientifically conducted a waste inventory or greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and waste management. Poor waste management accounted for 44% of our greenhouse emissions. And therefore, what are we doing? Yes, so we are calling for pragmatic solutions for this. And what we have decided is Accra is built up. Everywhere is built up. There are developments all over. There's no space for anything to be done. So what we need to do is we want to leverage on circular economy by way of making potential good use of the waste that is generated. Over 5,000 metric tons of waste are generated within the city of the whole entire Accra every single day. And yet we do not have any land space available to manage this waste when it comes to final disposal site. So we are just taking on what Honorable Mayor just said. We've done our feasibilities, we've done our analysis, and we are going the way of separating our organic waste from the rest of the waste. And when we do that, we know that yes, if you do not manage waste very well, the whole of African continent, the waste composition is over 50% made up of organics. And it is these organics that are the cause of greenhouse gas emissions. The danger here is methane, which is generated through poor organic waste management, has a higher global warming potential than even carbon dioxide. So what we need to do here is to get the organic waste to be treated. And the means of treatment, here we are talking about anaerobic digestion, to get the biogas, clean it up into biomethane, and bottle it up to support domestic cooking as a substitute for LPG gas. When we do that, the digested sludge from the anaerobic digestion process will also be channeled into briquettes and compost to support urban farming. Urban farming here will manage the sludge with fecal sludge in order to get a very good blend of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that is required to support agriculture for plant growth. And this we are doing in order for us to close in the loop, in order to leave nothing to chance. What we want to actually take to the final disposal site will be the unwanted waste that nothing can be done with after the recyclables have been turned into good economic use. So yes, to do this is like the other day, like I was saying, this is a win-win situation here. The funds that Honorable Ambassador did mention, we are quite ready and we are just ready to take off. What do I mean? We produce very little greenhouse gases, but yet we are the most impacted. And when it comes to carbon sinks, Africa has the vegetation to support the carbon sink by way of getting the carbon sequestrated from the environment. So if we are able to get funds to support the CAPEX, that is the capital expenditure, in order to get the infrastructure that is needed to turn these organics into biogas that will favorably be affordable for the low income in society, they wouldn't go to the mangroves, they wouldn't go into the forest, they wouldn't go into the farms to cut down trees for use as fuel, for charcoal, and et cetera, et cetera. in so doing, it means we are preserving nature and we are preserving the vegetation that is there to make use of photosynthesis to sequestrate the carbon that the industrialized cities from Europe and the Americas are churning every day into the atmosphere to be reduced in order for us to remain at the 1.5 or 2 degrees level that we have all targeted. And so, yes, if we do not take the bull by the horns, we as African cities, to take this challenge ourselves, definitely we will be the most impacted. And so we are putting up innovative solutions, which are very practical in nature, in order for us. We are not going to take hook, line, and sinker technologies that will be imported from elsewhere that will not be adaptable to our local situations. A typical example is we did one project in waste management where we did not separate the waste, but rather did material recovery facility implementation. And what we realized was that it was not completely in sync with our local situation. Why? The organics that I'm talking about, which is huge, also has a lot of moisture content. And by way of our culture and the way of living that we have, our staple food is mainly starchy. We take a lot of starchy foods. So the leachate that comes from this organic waste has the tendency to create a very viscous fluid. So there is waste, but it has a very sticky liquid amongst it in the organics. So this gets stuck to the rubbers, it gets stuck to the paper, it gets stuck to everything. So when you put this waste into the machine to separate them, you are not going to get results, because in the process, you only put them into the rotary trommel that will just get out silt. You know, in our part of the world, we do not pave just like anyhow. So when we sweep, we gather silt with it. So at the end of the day, your material recovery plant that you have will be generating silt over 60%. Hence, when you channel it into producing compost, you are not going to get the needed quality that you need to support urban farming. And it should be urban farming because in the city of Accra, there are no arable lands. So what we want to leverage on is to rely on this composting process to generate compost. You can just get a container, cut it, put compost inside, and then you'll be growing tomatoes right on top of your roof. You'll be growing tomato at your backyard, anywhere you can find. And then life will be very affordable and meaningful for all of us. So as signatories to COMSA, we are very much happy to be here. And these events are particularly very important for us to share our experiences, tap into our knowledge bases, tap into the innovations, and especially on our road towards getting carbon neutral. And we shouldn't always sit down and fold our hands and look in despair, but take the bull by the horns, like I'm saying, to get innovation and actually turn our youth who are into science and engineering into creating wealth from the waste that is killing us rather than leaving it ajar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Engineer. So we've heard Kelemani is moving, Kampala is moving, Accra is moving, AfDB. Come on up and tell us how you're moving. I'm hearing particularly this comment around we're doing great work, we've got good demonstration projects we want to scale. So I think that's good for AfDB to hear, right?
Hello, good. Thank you again for inviting us to be part of this conversation. It's not an easy conversation, I have to say, and we have to commend the leadership of these great leaders and the work you're doing. Let's do a simple, imagination. Let's imagine that this room is full of the presidents of all African countries. And if we were to ask them one single thing that they prioritize most chances are that they won't mention all of them energy. They probably say security. They could say broad-term development. Now, if you had to repeat the same experiment, bringing together the mayors in the same room, independent of the president, chances are that their choice of what is very significant may be different. Does that make sense? Because there is a layer of development that is closer to the reality of the day than the one that is trying to look at political settlement, political unity. And we must be able to appreciate that and understand this within the whole power dynamics of a country. So the mayor will be more interested in water, will be more interested in waste management, will be more interested in energy, as opposed to the president that will be more interested in keeping the country together, or making sure that we don't disintegrate. Does that make sense to us? And it's very important that we are able to understand what is the entry point for development when it comes to the work that we want to do. And I'll tell you this, we need to understand two contexts, one of them is the fact that the population growth we are experiencing in Africa, 80% of that proportion of that growth over the next 30 years will happen in urban centers. And it's going to happen in cities. So it's not just growth, it's also growth in cities. So cities are going to become mega cities. And unfortunately, the cities, as they were right now, is already challenging. And so we're not sure if the pace of development happening in the cities can catch up with the pace of population growth. And that presents a new form of challenge for us. Let me say this, renewable energy and the whole thing about just transition. And please, I want to put this across. When we use the word transition, my layman English is quickly telling me you're moving from one thing to another. What do you still call it transition when you're moving from zero? Because we may be talking about brown energy or other forms of energy, and we're talking about transition to clean energy. But when we are talking about the level of energy poverty that we're experiencing in Africa, then you need to requalify what you call transition, because it won't be transition if you're moving from nothing to something. And I think it's very, very important that we qualify that. And so for us at the African Development Bank, the work that we've done over the last few years, and I won't go too far into 20 years, in the last 5 years alone, 85% of all our energy investments across Africa, they are renewable energy, 85%. And these have been able to lead to electrification of homes, of industries, of cities, and 21 million people touched. And I want to say this clearly, because in the same way, it's important to emphasize that we've seen tremendous growth in some countries. This problem can be solved. It's a solvable problem. And I want us to understand that. And some large-scale investment, one or two of them, can have a huge impact. In the last 10 years, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the last mile connectivity in Kenya. And that has led to an electrification rate of something close to 75% today by the African Development Bank alone. So one actor, and just imagine what other actors can do. In Rwanda, we've got a program, $790 million. And that program, and basically both at the generation side, but also at the distribution, has led to electrification rate of from 15% in 2016 to about 56% or 58% now. And when you combine that with what others are doing, the goal is that in Rwanda, by 2025, you want to have close to 100% electrification. And these things are very possible. So what is important is, I don't want us to look at energy as a pure project thing. It's very much nested within the overarching political economy of the country. It's very much nested within what we allocate priorities to, but it's also very much nested within what we are willing to collaborate, to build new forms of partnership in doing. And I think that's something that's very important. Now, it's also important that it's one thing to be able to generate energy or electricity. It's another thing to ensure that the affordability is there. Because if you cannot ensure affordability, so you can have installed capacity or in terms of generation, But when it comes to the people who need it, who are able to use it to improve their livelihoods, to expand businesses, and ultimately create a space for economic growth or contribute to it, if they cannot afford it, you wouldn't have made any progress. Today, as we speak, we're talking on an average of 13 cents per kilowatt per hour, US dollar cent in Africa. And some of them in a country like Somalia, they pay as high as 85 cents. Now, when you combine that to America and Europe, we're talking of anything between 4 to 6 cents per kilowatt per hour. So if the affordability part of it is very crucial, and we have to think about what will it take and to make it. And sometimes it may just be investment in efficiency, because what the consumer is paying for is also the cost of the inefficiency by the utility companies. And this is something over and over again that at the African Development Bank we're looking at. So let me talk about the money, because it's important to set this scene and make it clear that, you know, you're not just going to have these millions and these billions. It has to be very much nested within this strategic framework that you are very passionate about in your country. And also probably it's going to be a difficult job for the mayors to be able to navigate this political landscape about dealing with development partners. So for us at the bank, what we've been able to do is to just improve on our ability to blend financing together in a way that we make the cost of generation to be very cheap, both on the public sector side, but also on the private sector side. We've got a project in Kenya, Lake Turkana wind power project. It's 310 megawatts, the largest wind farm in Africa. This is a project that involves about 11 financiers. So AfDB, together with the government of Kenya, we use our convening power to be able to bring all of them around the table. And by coming in at a low pricing, everyone had to come in at a low pricing as well. Number two, we were also able to combine that multiple financial actors with multiple instruments at different levels. So there were grants involved, there were guarantees involved as well for the offtake, but also there were also concessional loans and as well as equity in it. And this is something that we can do. We've done it over and over again, that we can expand on the menu of instruments available to us. Think of yourself, if you went to a restaurant and they just got 2 items on the menu, and if you were told of another restaurant where they've got 20 items on the menu, chances are that you will consider going to the other restaurant with a number of options. So by increasing the instruments available, we have an opportunity to blend them and to see what works in different contexts, and ultimately as well to see how we can structure that within the overarching political system of the country. And please, I want to say this and this again, because it's not just projects in isolation or projects existing in vacuum. Projects are nested within the state-society interrelationship. And that's why it's important, again, coming back to it, that by blending those different instruments, by making capital available. So on average, we put about anything between $1.5 to $2 billion every year for energy investment in the bank. And we'll be doing that, and our goal is to scale that up. Now, when you compare that to the fact that Africa needs anything between 30 to $40 billion of investment every year over the next 10 years, then you can think of what one actor is doing. Now, combine that with private and public actors, we're able to get this done. Again, I want to say this. We are talking about a problem that is solvable. It would have been a different thing if we're still trying to bring about the technical possibility of doing anything. These are problems that are solvable. And by having that, and I think it's very important that we can leverage on that, that positive thing. The last point I want to say is to also begin to look at the fact that we have an opportunity, given our context in Africa, to decentralize these energy forms. Not everybody is going to be connected to the national grid. And in some cases, it may be too expensive to even do generation in your country if you can partner with a neighboring country where the cost of generation is way cheaper. And that is what is happening in East Africa, because cost of generation in Ethiopia is way cheaper compared to cost of generation perhaps in Burundi or in Tanzania. And so by having a regionality sense in the solution, we also have an opportunity to leverage on our comparative advantage and to be able to do this together. So I don't think I came here with a checkbook to tell you money is available, but I wanted you to get a sense of the context, but also to see the opportunity for partnership and to also appreciate the fact that collectively we can solve this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have solutions, but there's work to be done. And I think what's quite exciting about what was said from the African Development Bank is that initiatives like COMSA are providing the technical assistance that cities need to be able to start crowding and funding and look at these funding opportunities. So some more positive news on a very difficult topic. So Laura, we're going to go to you last before we try and take a question from the floor and also from our virtual audience. What's REN21 doing? What's REN21 seeing in terms of this transition or not transition in the just energy space? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And there's always an advantage and disadvantage for going last. The good thing is that you get to build on what everybody else has been talking about. And what I'd like to build on is actually what was just being said by the AfDB about supporting the strategic framework. We've heard about initiatives, we've heard about priorities, the funding mechanisms that are in place. And this really needs to be underpinned by policies and targets. And what we find is that from the work that REN21 is doing is that there are initiatives at the local level, at the city level, that are really having these targets about we want to bring energy services to X amount of the population. But what we really need to make sure is that these are underpinned by policies. You know, we can have targets for a number of electric vehicles, for example, that are in a town, or a certain bus fleet that is running on clean energy. But oftentimes we're not looking at where is that energy source coming from. So you'll find, not so much here in Africa, but you'll find in other parts of the world that there's been a big push. There is a big push for electric vehicles. But then the conversation stops at the electric vehicle part, and there is no tying with the national policy as to how are those electric vehicles actually being fueled? Where is that electricity coming from? So we have a mismatch between what the target is and what a policy could be to really drive renewable energy uptake. I think we haven't been, what we've been seeing and have become a bit critical about is in the renewable energy sector, we have not been very smart about having this more holistic perspective. We have been very, very focused on the supply side. So where is the energy coming from? What are the technologies? How are they being used? And really not looking at the demand side. What are we trying to fill? Where is it that renewable energy can bring an added value that can really support a just energy transition, energy access, not only to power, but to heating, cooling, and transport. And, you know, it's a huge gap. I'm going to talk globally because we're a global network, but in a report we just recently released, that if we look at the number of policies and that are in place, you have about 793 which are around electricity, so the power aspect. But we only have 170 for heating and cooling and 80 for transport. And yet, if we look at the total final energy consumption, 80% of all our total final energy consumption at the global level, 80% of that is heating and cooling and transport. So if we're talking about a just energy transition, if we're really talking about climate proofing our communities and meeting these climate objectives, we really need to have this broader perspective. And so the importance of policy being able to set that broader framework, whether it be at the local level, the city level, or the national level, and then those targets to really meet those policy objectives. Another thing is, and this is a bit obvious, but I think it bears saying, is there needs to be a long-term commitment. You put policies in place, the business sector needs to know that policy will continue until there is investment that is return on that investment. But the reality is that political structures change. We have elections, democratically, hopefully, elected leaders that bring in new ideas and new concepts. And oftentimes those policies will change. And so in order to really help to underpin those longer term perspectives, we really have to make sure that we have societal buy-in. We really have to make sure that we are securing societal community buy-in to these changes, as well as the market acceptance, both for the technologies, but also the policies that are put in place. I think what I'd just like really to end with is taking one aspect of the urban environment, and that's the building stock. 60% in the African region, 60% of all total final energy consumption is happening in the building sector. That's huge. That's both embedded carbon, so that's the carbon that is in the building materials, but it's also in the carbon that is being used in those buildings for heating, cooling, and for lighting. Seeing urban migration, I'm sure you're seeing it in your cities. And so there's a real need to make sure that we're really addressing the whole spectrum of the energy situation. Yes, we need access to electricity, but we must also be very much looking at the heating and cooling aspects, particularly cold chain for food and food security, and then the mobility aspect, transport. How are we moving our populations around? And so just quickly in closing, we really need to move from this sort of current linear, kind of extractive, single-use approach that is often very much driven by a siloed perspective of we have this need, therefore this is this solution, and really move to this more circular, low-carbon, renewable energy perspective, where we're really looking at the systemic perspective of how are these various aspects of healthy, sustainable, climate-resilient communities. What are the services that are being demanded, that are needed from the populations, and how do we meet them? And I would like to just build on what the ambassador said earlier. We don't need to repeat the mistakes that the global north or the industrialized countries or whatever the terminology is for those of us who are living in quote unquote industrialized countries. There is African agency. There is so much that is happening on this continent. There is so much potential and innovation. And I think the very fact that we're having these conversations really demonstrates the power and the initiative of what's happening. And it starts at the city level. It really is the communities and how they are building and how they are committing to how they function as economic units that are really going to drive this transition on the continent. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Just want to say a special thank you on behalf of COMSA to the Honourable Ambassador, to the Honourable Mayors, to the city representatives, to the AfDB, to REN21 for really thoughtful inputs. We'll be taking this forward as COMSA into messages towards COP27, but just a heartfelt thank you really so much for your inputs. We have been given a few extra minutes, and so I'd really love to see from the room if there are perhaps any comments or questions. We can take 2 or 3 before we need to move out because the next session is coming in. So just by a raise of hands, Hastings, I see yours. The gentleman with the hat. We can take one more. Okay, let me go to Hastings first. Hastings, the Regional Director of C40.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, the speakers, for really, really wonderful interventions. This morning, I learned about leaders leading from the front and leading by example. I just want to find out from the city leaders in the room, how are we demonstrating energy transition? How are we harnessing renewable energies? Are we moving to renewable energy in our municipal buildings? I see that Lagos had hospitals, schools, even the Lagos State building transition to solar. Dakar is doing the same. How are we doing in our cities in leading the city residents to transition to renewable energy?
Thank you, Hastings. We'll take yours and then yours.
Bonjour à l'Assemblée, c'est Monsieur Michael Akonda, membre de la société civile, consultant en marketing social et environnemental, résident au Gabon. Alors, merci Madame la modératrice de me donner la parole. Merci aux panélistes et aux maires ici. Alors, je vais prendre la parole ici en tant que jeune. J'aimerais ici dire que l'Afrique, nous savons que l'Afrique n'est pas le continent qui pollue plus et qui a besoin de soutien. Nous savons que nous avons des produits, du plastique. Nous avons aussi ici, nous voulons aussi mettre en place l'économie renouvelable, l'économie durable et l'économie verte. Alors, moi, j'aimerais que les maires des différents pays aident les jeunes à s'intégrer à l'intérieur et qui peuvent même aider même les jeunes qui ont des projets. Donc, c'était ça ma petite contribution. Madame la modératrice.
My name is William Abala. I'm from Kenya. And okay, my question is partly on like the AfDB. You've talked about maybe, you know, the movement from, you know, now just transition and financing. So my question is, I mean, when you people are always doing this, you know, kind of projects, for example, you've talked about, you know, the wind project in Turkana. So do you sometimes, you know, like just apart from maybe the environmental, you know, impact assessment that you do you also kind of, you know, like do assessment in terms of maybe the burden of such maybe just transition could, you know, result into maybe more taxes, you see? Yeah, for example, maybe the project stalls, at the end of it, we're told about, you know, logistics, nightmares, you know, 2-3 years down the line, a 70 billion project, you know, isn't functioning. I mean, but, you know, as a country, maybe it's a loan, people now have to, you know, the government has to increase taxes, you see. So in that, you know, form, do you kind of, you know, like talk about just transitioning and in terms of, you know, like things that are going to create, you know, more taxes to the citizens, for example? Then my last question would be on just transition, but now in terms of, you know, scaling it down to the common, you know, the common man. So I've seen a situation whereby, you know, there are projects, let's say maybe the solar, then they're done into homes. But the way they normally do them is, you know, a kind of, it's a kind of a model whereby, you know, people are given the let's say the solar lights. So in terms of maybe the payment, then they're told maybe to pay in terms of maybe installment, like maybe a day, you use it a day, then there's a kind of a cash that they charge you, you see. So it's kind of, to me, it's kind of, you know, a way of, you know, like you're trying to force people into something that sometimes they do not even have that money to let's say, even to purchase, like a token. You purchase a token, then you use. For example, let's say there are lights. So you're told that you have to pay maybe, you know, in terms of maybe $1, that is when you can use it. So you use that light for a maximum of a period. Then after that, it automatically, you know, shuts down. So we've seen kind of, you know, models trying to, you know, put this just transition into people, but at some extent, you see like they're being maybe, you know, kind of being forced into it. Sometimes they do not even have maybe food, maybe the money that was supposed to be used on food. Yeah, but now you find that it has to be, you know, go into this other one. So the pickup rate sometimes is too low for this just transition. And this is basically for the common man back at the villages, you know, those who are not really cannot even afford, you know, putting, you know, food into the table. So could you also maybe elaborate on such plans? Yeah.
Thank you so much. So what I heard in those 3 questions was it's mainly to our mayors. So I'm going to give it to our 2 mayors to round us off for the session. Mayor Raja, you first. Deputy Lord Mayor of Kampala, you next, and then we will close the session. Any reflections from the 2 of you in terms of those 3 questions?
Well, I mean, asking this question was so loaded that I don't know how to unload it. But the right answer is we are almost doing nothing. We are very close to zero in terms of action talking, we talk, but about the doing, we are very far. I mean, being honest. And I've been asking, why is it happening? I thought, how can I answer to ask things for him to understand what is going through my head? One is like, on the 21st of August, which was Kelimani Day, I inaugurated the first cycle line in Mozambique. That was in my city, the first. Other cities don't have even a single meter. My question was, why? We've been talking, and like my country signed the Paris Agreement and so on. We talk about decarbonized transport modes, but nothing is happening on the ground. Well, when I had the accident, that was one day before inaugurating this cycle line. I mean, incidentally, 3 days after, I was talking to people. I said, look, I think now I need to stop and pay more attention to disabled people, because now I feel what they feel. Because I'm wearing their shoes. I mean, it wasn't by will, but I'm in their shoes. Now I understand the impairing factors that they face. So like being in Brussels or in London, whatever, talking about climate change is very different from being where it is felt and where it happened. So sometimes we need to borrow other people's shoes to understand what's really going on. And I ask myself too, why I'm like one of the few who is always invited to these conferences. Because I've got a competitive advantage. I speak English. In my country, we speak Portuguese. So like for what we are discussing here, my mayors, they can follow. They're away, they're in another world. We only depend on two countries, Brazil or Portugal, which don't have resources to influence the debate. So there is something that I will call the political economy of climate change discourse and practice. There is a kind of racism in terms of language, in terms of practice, and so on. Those who speak Portuguese, we are left out of most of these discourse and debates. I mean, of course, I'm just answering from the perspective of my own country. But because I'm trying to understand why things are not happening on the ground. If I say like the only example I know about the tentative of using waste into biogas and to energy in all my country, like we have 30 million people. It's like in my city. My question is, other mayors don't see that, that there is a debate going on. So my point is, like, I think we have two options. I mean, we can move with those who are aware or whatever, and then leave others behind, or then we need to change our strategy and involve everyone so that we can move together. Otherwise, we are going to have like first-class cities and then others who are really left behind. And I'm really worried about those who are left behind because of so many barriers. I only showed you or brought here the language barrier. It's just one, but there are so many barriers. So we need to really take time and reflect about those barriers and try to be inclusive. Because if you're talking about justice, energy justice, then also we need to think about information sharing, awareness sharing, so that people have got access to the debates. We are going to COP. 90% of mayors in my country, they don't know about what's going to happen at the COP. They're not aware. I don't know whose fault is it, but that's the reality. Because before coming here, I called some of them, which I think they're the most informed mayors. And they're like, COP? What do you mean? What is COP? So, I mean, I may be very negative, but I'm bringing the reality. So I think we need to really, like, to think about what we are doing, what we are talking, and with whom we want to move. If we want to move just ourselves, or if we want to be inclusive.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Deputy Lord Mayor, we have to close. We've got people coming in for the next session. I want to thank everyone for participating. Please stay and have conversations with us, but let's leave the buildings so that the next session can start. We have run late. Thank you so much to everyone.
Sorry.
You overspoke and